The ancient manuscript lay open on the mahogany desk, its yellowed pages covered in elegant Sanskrit characters that had remained unreadable for over 3 decades. Alexander Rothschild III stared at the text with the same mixture of fascination and frustration that had consumed him since inheriting it from his grandfather's estate. The tech mogul who had revolutionized artificial intelligence and built a fortune worth $800 million found himself completely powerless against these mysterious symbols that seemed to mock his every achievement. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather-bound document had arrived with his grandfather's will, accompanied by a cryptic note that read, "Alexander, this manuscript holds the key to everything our family has sought. The day you understand its message will be the day you truly understand wealth." For 32 years, the text had haunted him, becoming an obsession that had cost him marriages, friendships, and countless sleepless nights. He had hired Sanskrit scholars from Harvard, Oxford, and Delhi University. He had consulted with monks from Tibetan monasteries and professors from ancient Indian universities. Each expert had provided different translations, conflicting interpretations, and ultimately, no satisfying answers. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Rothschild's Malibu estate as he made his way to the kitchen, the manuscript tucked under his arm as always. At 63, Alexander had developed the habit of carrying the document everywhere, hoping that a change of environment might somehow unlock its secrets. His latest attempt had been with Professor Rajesh Sharma from the University of Mumbai, a renowned Sanskrit expert who had spent 2 weeks at the estate, only to declare the text, quote, philosophically ambiguous and open to multiple interpretations. The kitchen was already bustling with activity when Alexander entered. His executive chef, Marcus Beaumont, was directing the morning preparations with his usual theatrical flair, while the sous chefs moved around him like dancers in a carefully choreographed performance. But it was the quiet figure in the corner who caught Alexander's attention. Priya Devi had been working as a kitchen assistant for only 2 months, yet there was something about her presence that commanded respect despite her humble position. At 28, Priya possessed an otherworldly serenity that seemed completely out of place in the high-pressure environment of a billionaire's kitchen. She moved with graceful efficiency, her long black hair always neatly braided, her simple white uniform immaculate despite the demanding work. What intrigued Alexander most was her habit of humming ancient melodies while she worked, songs that seemed to transport the entire kitchen to a more peaceful realm. Marcus had hired Priya through a local employment agency after their previous kitchen assistant had quit without notice. Her resume was unremarkable. She had worked in various restaurants throughout Los Angeles, always in supporting roles, never seeking advancement or recognition. When Marcus had asked about her background during the interview, she had simply said she was from a small village in northern India and preferred to let her work speak for itself. What Marcus hadn't mentioned to Alexander was that Priya had an unusual habit of arriving early each morning to spend time in quiet meditation before the kitchen came alive. She would sit in the small herb garden adjacent to the kitchen, her eyes closed, her lips moving silently as if reciting prayers or mantras. The other staff members had grown accustomed to this ritual, but Marcus found it oddly comforting, as if her presence brought a sense of peace to their chaotic world. Alexander placed the manuscript on the kitchen island and rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar weight of another sleepless night. The document had cost him his 3rd marriage just 6 months earlier, when his wife Catherine had finally grown tired of competing with an ancient text for her husband's attention. "You care more about dead Sanskrit than living people," she had said during their final argument, and Alexander couldn't deny the truth in her words. The obsession had started innocently enough. As a young entrepreneur building his first software company, Alexander had been fascinated by his grandfather's stories about ancient wisdom and hidden knowledge. When he inherited the manuscript at 31, already worth $50 million from his first tech startup, he had approached it like any other problem to be solved through resources and determination. He had spent millions hiring experts, funding research expeditions to ancient libraries in India, and even establishing a Sanskrit studies program at UCLA in hopes of finding someone who could unlock the text's meaning. Each failure had only intensified his obsession, driving him to achieve greater financial success as if wealth itself might somehow provide the key to understanding. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man who had revolutionized language processing through artificial intelligence couldn't decode a single page of ancient text. His companies had developed algorithms that could translate dozens of modern languages in real time, but the manuscript remained as mysterious as the day he first laid eyes on it. Priya noticed Alexander's troubled expression as she quietly prepared fresh mint tea, a habit she had developed after observing his morning routine. Without being asked, she would always have a cup ready, flavored with cardamom and honey in the traditional Indian style her grandmother had taught her. Alexander had grown to appreciate these small gestures, though he rarely acknowledged them directly. "Another sleepless night with your ancient mystery?" Marcus asked, glancing at the manuscript while directing a sous chef to adjust the seasoning on the morning's fruit compote. Over the 2 months since Priya's arrival, the entire kitchen staff had become accustomed to Alexander's morning visits with his mysterious document. Alexander nodded wearily, accepting the cup of tea that Priya placed beside him with a grateful smile. Professor Sharma's translation made even less sense than the others. According to him, it's either a meditation on the nature of reality or a cookbook for spiritual enlightenment. I'm beginning to think this manuscript is just elaborate nonsense. The kitchen fell into a comfortable rhythm around them as Alexander opened the manuscript once again, his eyes scanning the intricate Sanskrit characters that seemed to dance mockingly across the aged parchment. He had memorized every curve and line, yet their meaning remained as elusive as morning mist. Priya continued her work silently, but Alexander noticed her glance toward the manuscript several times, her expression thoughtful rather than curious. Unlike the other staff members who had grown bored with his obsession, she seemed genuinely interested in the ancient text, though she never commented or asked questions about it. The morning progressed with its usual efficiency, until Alexander's phone rang, interrupting the peaceful atmosphere. His assistant's voice carried a note of excitement that immediately caught his attention. "Mr. Rothschild, I have potentially good news about the manuscript. There's a Professor Elena Volkov, from the Moscow Institute of Oriental Studies, who claims to have expertise in rare Sanskrit texts. She's willing to fly out next week if you're interested." Alexander sighed, feeling the familiar mixture of hope and skepticism that accompanied each new expert. "What makes her different from the others, Jennifer?" "She specializes in what she calls esoteric Sanskrit, apparently texts that were written in coded or symbolic language rather than literal translations. Her credentials are impressive, and she's published several papers on similar manuscripts." Despite his growing cynicism, Alexander found himself agreeing to the consultation. Professor Volkov represented expert number 43 in his 3-decade quest, and he couldn't help but hope that perhaps this time would be different. After ending the call, Alexander remained in the kitchen longer than usual, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of food preparation and the gentle presence of Priya as he worked nearby. There was something about her serene demeanor that seemed to ease the constant tension he carried, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. "You know," Marcus said, wiping his hands on his apron as he approached Alexander, "I've been thinking about your manuscript situation. Maybe you're approaching it from the wrong angle." Alexander looked up with mild interest. Marcus was an excellent chef, but hardly a scholar of ancient texts. "What do you mean?" "Well, in cooking, sometimes the most complex dishes have the simplest foundations. Maybe this Sanskrit thing isn't meant to be analyzed by academics. Maybe it needs someone who understands it from the heart rather than the head." The comment struck Alexander as oddly profound, though he wasn't sure why. He had certainly thrown enough intellectual firepower at the problem, without success. Perhaps Marcus had a point about approaching it differently, though he wasn't sure what alternative approach might work. Priya had been listening to their conversation while preparing vegetables for the lunch service, her knife moving in steady, meditative strokes as she worked. When she looked up, both men were surprised to see tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, setting down her knife and reaching for a towel to wipe her hands. "It's just that hearing you speak about ancient wisdom reminds me of my grandmother. She used to say that some knowledge can only be understood when the heart is ready to receive it." Alexander found himself genuinely curious about Priya's background for the first time since she had started working in his kitchen. "Your grandmother was a scholar?" Priya shook her head with a gentle smile. "No, she was just a village woman who couldn't read or write. But she knew things. About healing, about people, about the old ways. She said wisdom doesn't always come from books." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Alexander's business partner, David Chen, who burst into the kitchen with his characteristic energy. David had been Alexander's closest friend since their Stanford days, and had co-founded their first company with him 30 years earlier. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Unlike Alexander, David had maintained a sense of humor and perspective, despite their enormous success. Still trying to crack the family mystery? David asked, glancing at the manuscript with a mixture of affection and exasperation. He had watched Alexander's obsession grow over the years, and had long since given up trying to talk his friend out of it. Professor number 43 arrives next week, Alexander replied with a self-deprecating smile. Elena Volkov from Moscow. Apparently she specializes in esoteric Sanskrit. David rolled his eyes good-naturedly. Alex, my friend, you've spent more money on Sanskrit experts than most people spend on houses. Maybe it's time to consider that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Alexander had heard this advice countless times from David and others, but he couldn't let go of his grandfather's final words. The old man had been many things: a successful businessman, a devoted family man, a collector of rare artifacts, but he had never been given to flights of fancy or meaningless gestures. If he said the manuscript held the key to everything their family had sought, Alexander believed there had to be truth in those words. The kitchen gradually emptied as the morning prep work concluded and the staff moved on to other duties. Alexander remained at the island, lost in thought as he stared at the ancient text. Priya was one of the last to leave, having completed her assigned tasks with characteristic thoroughness. As she passed by the island, she paused for a moment, her eyes drawn to the manuscript despite herself. Alexander noticed her hesitation and looked up expectantly. I don't mean to intrude, Priya said carefully, but may I ask what the text is supposed to contain? I mean, what are you hoping to find in it? Alexander was surprised by the directness of her question, but found himself wanting to answer honestly. My grandfather believed it contained some kind of ultimate wisdom about wealth and success. He spent his entire life searching for its meaning and passed that search on to me. I've built my fortune hoping that somehow financial success would help me understand it, but nothing has worked. Priya nodded thoughtfully, her expression compassionate rather than skeptical. And you've consulted with many scholars? 42 experts over 30 years, Alexander replied with a bitter laugh. Sanskrit professors, religious scholars, linguists, historians, you name it. They all provide different translations, and none of them satisfy the feeling that I'm missing something essential. May I see it? Priya asked quietly. Alexander was about to decline automatically. The manuscript was too precious to be handled by kitchen staff, but something in Priya's tone made him reconsider. There was a quality of reverence in her voice that reminded him of his grandfather's approach to the text. He turned the manuscript toward her, watching as her eyes moved across the Sanskrit characters. To his surprise, her expression shifted from polite interest to something approaching recognition, though she said nothing for several long minutes. Finally, Priya looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. This is very old, she said simply. Yes, my grandfather acquired it in India sometime in the 1940s. Do you recognize any of the text? Priya hesitated, seeming to weigh her words carefully. My grandmother taught me to read some Sanskrit when I was young. She said it was important to understand the old prayers and stories. But this, she gestured toward the manuscript. This is written in a very formal style, much more complex than what I learned. Alexander felt a familiar surge of hope mixed with skepticism. Can you make out any of it? Some words, perhaps. But I wouldn't want to mislead you with incomplete understanding. My knowledge is very limited compared to the experts you've consulted. The humility in her response actually increased Alexander's interest. Every expert he had hired had been eager to provide definitive translations and interpretations, often contradicting each other with absolute confidence. Priya's cautious honesty was refreshing. Would you be willing to look at it more carefully? Alexander asked. Not as an expert consultation, just as someone with some knowledge of the language. I'd be curious to hear your perspective, even if it's incomplete. Priya glanced around the empty kitchen, seeming to consider the request carefully. I could try, but it would need to be during my free time. And you should understand that my grandmother's teaching was very different from academic study. She focused on the spiritual meaning rather than literal translation. That might be exactly what I need, Alexander replied, surprising himself with his enthusiasm. Every academic approach has failed. Maybe a different perspective is worth trying. They agreed that Priya would examine the manuscript during her evening break, when the kitchen duties were completed and she had time to focus properly. Alexander felt an unexpected sense of anticipation as he carefully closed the ancient text and returned it to its protective case. The rest of the day passed slowly for Alexander as he attended to his usual business responsibilities, but his mind kept returning to the conversation with Priya. There had been something in her expression when she first looked at the manuscript, a flicker of recognition that the academics had never shown. He tried not to let his hopes rise too high. He had been disappointed too many times before, but he couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps this time might be different. David stopped by Alexander's office that afternoon to review some quarterly reports, but noticed his friend's distracted state immediately. "You're thinking about the manuscript again, aren't you?" Alexander smiled ruefully. "The new kitchen assistant has some knowledge of Sanskrit. I asked her to take a look at it." David raised an eyebrow skeptically. "Alex, you've hired professors from the most prestigious universities in the world. Now you're consulting with kitchen staff?" "I know how it sounds," Alexander admitted. But there was something about her reaction when she saw the text. Maybe fresh eyes will see something the experts missed. Or maybe you're so desperate for answers that you're reading significance into nothing, David replied gently. "I'm worried about you, my friend. This obsession is consuming your life." Alexander knew David was right, but he couldn't let go of the possibility that Priya might provide the breakthrough he had been seeking. The conversation with her had felt different from his interactions with the various experts, more genuine and less performative. That evening, Alexander found himself lingering in the kitchen area long after the dinner service had concluded, waiting for Priya to finish her duties. When she finally approached him, carrying a cup of the mint tea she had prepared, he felt an unexpected nervousness. "I've been thinking about your manuscript all day," Priya said as she settled into a chair across from him. "Would it be possible for me to spend some quiet time with it? Sometimes these old texts reveal their meanings slowly, like flowers opening in the morning sun." Alexander was struck by the poetic nature of her language, so different from the clinical approach of the academics. He carefully opened the manuscript and positioned it so they could both see the ancient pages clearly. Priya spent several minutes in silence, her eyes moving methodically across the Sanskrit characters. Alexander watched her face intently, looking for any sign of understanding or recognition. What he saw was a quality of deep concentration mixed with what appeared to be reverence for the ancient text. "This is written in what my grandmother would have called the old style," Priya said finally. "The Sanskrit is very formal, very traditional, but there are some words here that I recognize from the prayers and stories she taught me." "What kind of words?" Alexander asked, leaning forward eagerly. "Words about seeking, about understanding, about the nature of true wealth." Priya traced a line of text with her finger without actually touching the ancient paper, but the way they're arranged is very complex. It's not just a simple narrative. There are layers of meaning woven together. Alexander felt his heart racing. This was already more insight than most of the experts had provided. "Can you give me any sense of what those layers might contain?" Priya was quiet for a long moment, her eyes continuing to scan the text. "I think, and please understand I could be completely wrong, but I think this might be what my grandmother called a, quote, teaching story. Not meant to be read literally, but understood as guidance for the spirit." "What kind of guidance?" "About the difference between having wealth and understanding wealth. About seeking treasure in the wrong places." Priya looked up at Alexander with an expression of gentle concern. "But I need much more time to be sure. And I want to be very careful not to mislead you with my limited knowledge." Alexander felt a surge of gratitude toward this humble woman who was approaching his life's obsession with such care and respect. "Take all the time you need. And please don't worry about being wrong. After 42 expert opinions that contradicted each other, I'm more interested in sincere effort than absolute certainty." They agreed to continue their sessions over the following evenings, with Priya dedicating an hour each night to studying the manuscript after her kitchen duties were completed. Alexander arranged for a comfortable reading area to be set up in the library adjacent to the kitchen, complete with proper lighting and magnifying equipment to protect both Priya's eyes and the ancient document. As Alexander prepared to leave that evening, Priya made one final observation that stopped him in his tracks. "Mr. Rothschild, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "In all your searching for the meaning of this text, have you ever considered that perhaps the answer isn't hidden in the words themselves, but in why you're so determined to find it?" The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. In 30 years of obsessive searching, no expert had ever asked him to examine his own motivations so directly. He stared at Priya, seeing her in an entirely new light. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes when we seek answers outside ourselves, it's because we already know the answer inside, but aren't ready to accept it." Priya's voice was gentle, but her words carried an unexpected weight. "My grandmother used to say that the questions we ask most desperately are often the ones we're most afraid to answer." Alexander left the kitchen that night with Priya's words echoing in his mind. For the first time in decades, he began to wonder if his approach to the manuscript had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Perhaps the key to understanding the ancient text lay not in deciphering its language, but in understanding why it had captured his soul so completely. The next morning brought news that Professor Volkov had arrived in Los Angeles a day early and was eager to begin her examination of the manuscript. Alexander found himself curiously reluctant to meet with her, preferring to continue his evening sessions with Priya. But professional courtesy demanded that he honor his commitment to the Russian scholar. Professor Volkov proved to be a formidable woman in her 50s, with sharp intelligence and an impressive command of Sanskrit scholarship. She spent 3 hours examining the manuscript with various magnification tools and reference materials, taking detailed notes and photographs throughout the process. "This is indeed a fascinating document," Professor Volkov concluded, removing her reading glasses and fixing Alexander with an intense stare. "The Sanskrit is archaic, probably dating to the medieval period. The content appears to be a philosophical treatise on the nature of material versus spiritual wealth." Alexander felt the familiar mixture of hope and skepticism. "Can you provide a translation?" "Certainly, though as with all ancient texts, there are multiple possible interpretations." Professor Volkov opened her notebook and began reading from her notes. The central theme appears to be a dialogue between a seeker and a wise teacher about the futility of pursuing external treasures when the greatest treasure lies within. It's quite similar to many other Sanskrit texts on spiritual enlightenment. The translation that followed was elegant and scholarly, but Alexander found himself feeling strangely empty as he listened. Professor Volkov's interpretation made perfect sense from an academic standpoint, yet it felt somehow sterile and disconnected from the passion that had driven his grandfather to preserve the manuscript. After Professor Volkov departed with her substantial consultation fee, Alexander returned to the kitchen to find Priya preparing vegetables for the evening meal. He shared the Russian scholar's translation with her, curious to hear her response. Priya listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. "That's a beautiful interpretation," she said when he finished. "Professor Volkov is clearly very learned, but may I ask how it made you feel when you heard it?" The question caught Alexander off guard. "What do you mean?" "Did her translation resonate with your heart? Did it feel like the answer your grandfather wanted you to find?" Alexander considered the question honestly. "No," he admitted. "It felt true, but incomplete. Like a photograph of a sunset rather than the actual experience of watching the sunset." Priya nodded, as if she had expected this response. "That's what my grandmother meant about the difference between knowing something with your mind and understanding it with your spirit. Sometimes the most accurate translation isn't the most truthful one." That evening, Alexander found himself more eager than ever for his session with Priya. She had spent the day thinking about Professor Volkov's translation and had some observations to share. "I've been comparing the Russian professor's reading with what I can understand of the original text," Priya began, settling into her chair with the manuscript open between them. "Her Sanskrit is much better than mine, and her translation is probably more accurate than anything I could provide. But I think she may have missed something important." "What's that?" "The emotional context. Professor Volkov read the text as a philosophical discourse, but I think it might be something more personal, more like a letter or a message from someone who had learned something precious and wanted to share it with someone they loved." Alexander felt his pulse quicken. This perspective had never occurred to him, but it aligned perfectly with his sense of the manuscript as his grandfather's legacy. A message to whom? To someone who was making the same mistakes the writer had made, someone who was seeking in all the wrong places and needed guidance to find their way home. Priya's voice carried a note of gentle certainty that Alexander found more compelling than all of Professor Volkov's academic credentials. Over the following week, their evening sessions took on an increasingly intimate quality, as Priya shared not just her interpretations of the Sanskrit text, but the wisdom her grandmother had passed down through generations of oral tradition. Alexander began to see the manuscript not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a bridge connecting him to something larger than his individual obsession. "Your grandfather must have loved you very much," Priya observed one evening as they worked through a particularly complex passage. "To leave you something so precious, even knowing how much it might trouble you." "Sometimes I wonder if he was trying to torture me," Alexander replied with dark humor, "giving me an unsolvable riddle that would consume my life. Or maybe he was trying to teach you the most important lesson of all," Priya suggested gently. "That some treasures can't be bought or earned or figured out. They can only be received with an open heart." The comment haunted Alexander for days afterward. He began to realize that his approach to the manuscript had been consistent with his approach to everything else in life, throwing resources and determination at a problem until it yielded to his will. But what if the manuscript required a completely different kind of engagement? The revelation came during their session on a Friday evening when Priya was working through a section of text that had puzzled every previous expert. She had been silent for nearly 20 minutes, her lips moving soundlessly as she seemed to be translating internally. "Mr. Rothschild," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think I understand what this passage is trying to say." Alexander leaned forward eagerly. "What is it?" "It's about a wealthy man who spent his entire life collecting treasures, believing that enough wealth would eventually purchase wisdom. But on his deathbed, he realized that he had been looking in the wrong direction all along. The greatest treasure wasn't something to be acquired. It was something to be shared." The words hit Alexander with stunning force. He stared at Priya, seeing not just a kitchen assistant with limited Sanskrit knowledge, but a woman whose understanding ran deeper than any academic expertise. The passage goes on to describe how the wealthy man's greatest joy came not from accumulating riches, but from using his resources to ease the suffering of others, from creating connections between people, from building something larger than himself. Alexander felt tears forming in his eyes as the meaning of his grandfather's gift finally became clear. The manuscript hadn't been a riddle to solve or a treasure map to follow. It had been a mirror, reflecting back the questions he needed to ask about his own life and priorities. "There's more," Priya continued, her voice gentle with understanding. "The text says that true wealth is measured not by what we possess, but by what possesses us. And the only thing worthy of possessing a human soul is love. Love for family, for community, for the divine mystery that connects all things." As Alexander sat in the quiet library, surrounded by the luxury his success had purchased, he began to understand why every expert translation had left him feeling empty. They had captured the words, but missed the heart of the message. It had taken someone who understood love and loss, someone who approached ancient wisdom with humility rather than academic ambition, to unlock the true meaning of his grandfather's gift. The manuscript hadn't been meant to add to his wealth or enhance his success. It had been intended to help him understand what wealth truly meant, and why his grandfather had ultimately found his greatest treasure not in business achievements but in the family he had built and the love he had shared. Alexander's hands trembled as he absorbed Priya's interpretation of the manuscript. The revelation struck him with the force of a lightning bolt, illuminating decades of misguided searching in a single moment of clarity. For 30 years, he had approached his grandfather's gift as a puzzle to be conquered, a code to be cracked through sheer intellectual force and unlimited resources. Now, sitting in the gentle glow of the library lamp with this remarkable woman who had unlocked what 42 experts could not, he finally understood the profound irony of his quest. The wealthy man who could buy anything except understanding had been searching for wisdom in the wrong currency entirely. Every Sanskrit scholar, every linguistic expert, every academic authority he had consulted had approached the manuscript as an artifact to be analyzed rather than a message to be received. They had dissected the words with surgical precision while completely missing the soul of the text. Priya continued reading, her voice soft but carrying an authority that transcended her humble position in his household. The manuscript speaks of a merchant who traveled to distant lands seeking a rare jewel that was said to grant the owner infinite prosperity. He spent years and fortunes pursuing rumors and legends, consulting with sages and scholars, believing that knowledge alone would lead him to his prize. Alexander felt a chill of recognition. The parallel to his own journey was unmistakable, down to the consultation with experts and the years of obsessive searching. His grandfather had somehow known exactly what path his grandson would follow, leaving him a mirror disguised as a mystery. But the merchant's greatest discovery came not when he found the jewel, but when he realized he had been carrying it with him all along. Priya continued, her eyes meeting Alexander's with gentle understanding. The treasure he sought in distant lands existed within his own capacity to create joy, to build connections, to use his resources as instruments of love rather than monuments to achievement. The words settled into Alexander's consciousness like seeds finding fertile ground. He thought about his 3 failed marriages, each one ending because he had been too consumed with his obsession to truly invest in the relationship. He remembered his estranged daughter Sarah, who had stopped calling years ago because every conversation eventually turned to the manuscript and his endless theories about its meaning. He considered his friendship with David, loyal despite decades of watching his best friend disappear into an increasingly isolated world of academic consultations and futile translations. "There's something else," Priya said, turning to a page near the end of the manuscript that Alexander had memorized but never understood. This section seems to be instructions, like a recipe or a formula, but not for creating wealth, for transforming it into something meaningful. Alexander leaned closer, his skepticism about kitchen staff consulting on ancient texts completely evaporated. Priya had demonstrated an intuitive understanding that surpassed every credentialed expert he had employed. Her approach was less about translation and more about translation, not just of words from one language to another, but of wisdom from one heart to another. "The text describes 3 stages of understanding," Priya explained, her finger hovering over the Sanskrit characters without touching the delicate parchment. "First, the recognition that external seeking cannot satisfy internal emptiness. Second, the acceptance that true wealth comes from what we give, rather than what we accumulate. And third, the commitment to use whatever resources we possess in service of something greater than ourselves." The framework hit Alexander like a master key sliding into a lock he had been trying to force open for 3 decades. Every expert had focused on literal translation of individual passages, missing the overarching structure that gave the words their meaning. It wasn't a philosophical treatise or a spiritual text in the academic sense. It was a practical guide for transformation, written by someone who had walked the same path of misguided seeking and wanted to help others avoid the same mistakes. "My grandfather," Alexander whispered, the pieces finally clicking into place. "He went through this same journey, didn't he? He spent his early years chasing external validation and material success, then learned something that changed everything about how he understood wealth." Priya nodded thoughtfully. "The manuscript feels very personal, like it was written by someone sharing hard-won wisdom with someone they loved. Not a teacher lecturing to students, but a grandfather speaking to his grandson." Alexander felt tears streaming down his face as 30 years of obsession suddenly transformed into 30 years of preparation. His grandfather hadn't left him a mystery to solve. He had left him a roadmap for the journey he knew his grandson would need to take. Every failed translation, every frustrated expert consultation, every sleepless night spent staring at incomprehensible Sanskrit had been necessary steps in reaching this moment of understanding. "But why did it take so long?" Alexander asked, as much to himself as to Priya. "Why couldn't any of the experts see what you're seeing?" "Maybe because they were approaching it with their minds instead of their hearts," Priya replied gently. "My grandmother always said that the most important truths can't be understood through study alone. They have to be lived, experienced, felt in the depths of our being. The experts could translate the words, but they hadn't walked the path the words describe." Alexander realized that his decades of seeking had been exactly the preparation necessary to receive the manuscript's true message. The experts had approached it as outsiders analyzing an artifact, but he was the intended recipient of a personal communication. The pain of his failed marriages, the isolation of his obsession, the emptiness despite his enormous success, all of it had been necessary to create the spiritual hunger that could finally digest the wisdom his grandfather had prepared for him. The transformation that followed wasn't immediate or dramatic, but it was profound and irreversible. Alexander began to see every aspect of his life through the lens of the manuscript's teaching about the difference between having wealth and understanding wealth. His business empire, his magnificent estate, his collection of art and luxury items, all of it suddenly appeared as raw material for something much more meaningful than personal accumulation. Over the following weeks, Alexander found himself spending more time in the kitchen than in his executive office, drawn to the simple wisdom that seemed to emanate from Priya's presence. Their evening sessions with the manuscript continued, but now they felt less like academic research and more like spiritual guidance. Priya would share stories her grandmother had told about the difference between cleverness and wisdom, between success and fulfillment, between having abundance and being abundant. "In my village," Priya explained one evening as they worked through another section of the manuscript, "there was an old man who was considered the wisest person in the community, even though he owned almost nothing. People would travel from far away to ask his advice about important decisions." "What made him so wise?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious about this world so different from his own experience of wealth and influence. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words came from a place of deep understanding rather than clever thinking. But most importantly, he used whatever little he had in service of others. His wisdom came not from what he knew, but from how he loved. The story resonated deeply with Alexander as he began to understand that his grandfather's manuscript wasn't just teaching him about wealth, it was teaching him about love. True abundance, according to the ancient text, could only be experienced when resources were transformed from instruments of accumulation into instruments of connection and service. Alexander began experimenting with this principle in small ways at first. He increased the salaries of his household staff significantly, not as a business expense, but as an expression of gratitude for their service. He established college funds for the children of his employees, seeing their education not as charity but as investment in the expansion of opportunity and hope. The response surprised him. Rather than simply accepting the benefits as their due, his staff began approaching their work with increased enthusiasm and creativity. The kitchen ran more smoothly, the gardens flourished under more attentive care, and the entire atmosphere of the estate shifted from professional efficiency to something approaching familial warmth. Marcus, the executive chef, was among the first to notice the change in Alexander's approach. "I don't know what's gotten into you lately," he commented one morning, as he observed Alexander chatting comfortably with the gardening staff. "But whatever it is, it's working. This place feels alive in a way it never has before." Alexander smiled, thinking about how his grandfather's wisdom was beginning to bear fruit in ways he never could have anticipated. The manuscript's teaching about transformation was proving itself through lived experience rather than theoretical understanding. The most significant test of Alexander's new understanding came when his daughter Sarah called unexpectedly one evening. They hadn't spoken in over 2 years, their relationship having deteriorated under the weight of his obsession with the manuscript and his general unavailability for anything resembling normal family connection. "Dad?" Sarah's voice carried a mixture of hesitation and hope that broke Alexander's heart. "I heard from David that you've been different lately. He said you seem happier, more present. I was wondering if maybe we could try having dinner together sometime." Alexander felt the manuscript's wisdom flowing through him as he realized this was exactly the kind of opportunity the ancient text had been preparing him to recognize and embrace. His daughter's call wasn't an interruption of his important work. It was the most important work possible. "Sarah, I would love nothing more than to have dinner with you," Alexander replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And I owe you an enormous apology for all the years I put my obsessions ahead of our relationship." They met the following week at a small restaurant Sarah chose, far from the luxury establishments Alexander typically frequented. As they sat across from each other in the modest but warm setting, Alexander found himself truly seeing his daughter for perhaps the first time in years. At 35, Sarah had built a successful career as a social worker, dedicating her life to helping children in foster care find stable homes. Her work was challenging and often heartbreaking, but her face glowed with a sense of purpose that Alexander envied. "I want to hear about your work," Alexander said, setting aside his own agenda for the conversation. "Really hear about it, not just the surface details." Sarah looked surprised but pleased by his genuine interest. She began describing the children she worked with, the families she helped reunite, the systemic challenges that made her job difficult but crucial. As Alexander listened, He began to understand that his daughter had intuitively discovered what he was just learning from the manuscript. That true fulfillment came from using whatever resources and abilities you possessed in service of something larger than yourself. The hardest part, Sarah explained, is seeing how much good we could do with more resources. There are programs that work, interventions that transform lives, but we're always operating on shoestring budgets. Meanwhile, there are people with enormous wealth who could change everything but never get involved, because they think charity is about writing checks rather than building relationships. Alexander felt the manuscript's wisdom crystallizing into a clear sense of purpose. His grandfather's gift had been preparing him for exactly this conversation, this opportunity to transform his resources from monuments to his success into instruments of meaningful change. What if someone wanted to get involved? Alexander asked carefully. Not just writing checks, but really partnering with people like you to create systemic change. What would that look like? Sarah's eyes lit up with excitement as she began describing her vision for comprehensive support systems that could address the root causes of family instability rather than just responding to crises. She talked about educational programs, mental health services, job training initiatives, and community centers that could create networks of support for vulnerable families. As Alexander listened to his daughter's passion and expertise, he realized that the manuscript's final teaching was becoming clear. The transformation of wealth into wisdom wasn't an abstract spiritual concept. It was a practical process of aligning resources with purpose, of using abundance to create more abundance for others. Over the following months, Alexander and Sarah began collaborating on what would become the Rothschild Foundation for Family Stability. Unlike the typical charitable foundations established by wealthy individuals, this organization was designed from the ground up to be a partnership between financial resources and frontline expertise. Sarah took a leave of absence from her social work position to develop the foundation's programs, while Alexander committed not just funding but his full attention and energy to the project. The Foundation's first initiative was a comprehensive support center in one of Los Angeles's most underserved neighborhoods. Rather than imposing solutions from above, they spent months listening to community members about their actual needs and priorities. The resulting program included job training, childcare, mental health services, educational support, and community organizing, all coordinated through a single location that felt more like a community center than a social service agency. Priya played an unexpected role in the foundation's development. Her insights about community building, drawn from her grandmother's wisdom about village life, proved invaluable in designing programs that created genuine connections rather than just providing services. She eventually transitioned from kitchen assistant to community outreach coordinator, her natural ability to build trust and understanding making her perfect for bridging different worlds. "This is what the manuscript was preparing you for," Priya observed one evening as they reviewed the Foundation's first-year impact report. The numbers were impressive. Hundreds of families served, dozens of jobs created, a measurable improvement in community stability, but more important was the qualitative change they could see in the neighborhood's sense of hope and possibility. Alexander nodded, finally understanding the full scope of his grandfather's gift. The ancient Sanskrit text hadn't been about accumulating wisdom as another form of wealth to be possessed. It had been about transforming understanding into action, turning resources into relationships, converting success into service. The Foundation's success attracted attention from other wealthy individuals who were seeking more meaningful ways to use their resources. Alexander found himself in the unexpected role of teacher, sharing not the specific strategies of the Foundation but the deeper principles he had learned from the manuscript about the transformation of wealth into wisdom. The key insight, Alexander would explain to other philanthropists, is that true generosity isn't about giving away what you don't need. It's about transforming your entire relationship with resources, seeing abundance as a responsibility rather than a privilege. These conversations led to the development of what became known as the Wisdom Circle, an informal network of individuals committed to approaching wealth as stewardship rather than ownership. The group met monthly, sharing experiences and insights about how to align financial resources with deeper purpose. David Chen was among the first to join the Wisdom Circle, inspired by the transformation he had witnessed in his friend. "I've watched Alex go from someone who was owned by his wealth to someone who owns his wealth in the truest sense," David told the group during one of their early meetings. "He's the same person, but he's operating from a completely different center of gravity." The most profound validation of Alexander's transformation came during a conversation with Professor Volkov, the Russian Sanskrit scholar who had provided the academically accurate but spiritually empty translation of the manuscript. She contacted Alexander a year after their consultation, curious about whether he had made any progress with the ancient text. "I've been thinking about your manuscript," Professor Volkov explained during their phone conversation. "My translation was technically correct, but I had the feeling I was missing something essential. Did you ever find what you were looking for?" Alexander smiled, remembering his own journey from seeking the right translation to receiving the right transformation. "I found something much better than what I was looking for," he replied. "I found what I actually needed." He went on to describe not the literal meaning of the Sanskrit text, but the way its wisdom had reshaped his understanding of wealth, success, and purpose. Professor Volkov listened with growing fascination, realizing that she had encountered something beyond the scope of academic analysis. "What you're describing sounds like the manuscript was more of a catalyst than a source of information," Professor Volkov observed. "As if the real wisdom was already within you, waiting for the right conditions to emerge." "Exactly," Alexander agreed. "The manuscript didn't give me new knowledge. It gave me a new way of understanding what I already possessed." The conversation with Professor Volkov crystallized Alexander's understanding of his grandfather's true gift. The Sanskrit text had been carefully chosen not because it contained unique information, but because it required the kind of spiritual preparation that could only come through years of sincere seeking. His grandfather had known that his grandson would need to exhaust all external sources of answers before becoming open to the internal source of wisdom. As the Foundation's work expanded and the wisdom circle grew, Alexander began receiving invitations to speak about his experience at conferences and universities. These talks invariably focused not on the specific content of the Sanskrit manuscript, but on the process of transformation from seeking to serving, from accumulating to abundance. "Wealth is like water," Alexander would explain to these audiences. "It can stagnate and become toxic when it's hoarded, or it can flow and create life wherever it goes. The choice isn't whether to have wealth, but what to do with whatever wealth you possess." The metaphor resonated with people across a wide range of economic circumstances, from billionaire philanthropists to middle-class professionals looking for more meaningful ways to use their resources. Alexander realized that his grandfather's wisdom wasn't limited to the very wealthy. It applied to anyone who had more than they needed to survive and wanted to transform that surplus into something meaningful. Sarah's work with the Foundation flourished as she discovered that having adequate resources allowed her to focus on innovation and relationship building rather than constantly scrambling for funding. The programs she developed became models for other communities, creating a ripple effect of positive change that extended far beyond their original scope. "You know what's funny?" Sarah commented during one of their regular father-daughter dinners, which had become a cherished weekly tradition. "I spent years resenting your obsession with that manuscript, thinking it was keeping you from being present with family. Now I realize it was preparing you to be more present than ever before." Alexander felt deep gratitude for the circuitous path that had led to this moment of connection with his daughter. The manuscript had indeed kept him from being present in the conventional sense, but it had ultimately taught him a quality of presence that was much deeper than mere physical availability. The evening sessions with Priya continued, but their focus had shifted from translation to integration. They would read sections of the manuscript together, not seeking new understanding but allowing the ancient wisdom to deepen their appreciation for the transformation they were witnessing in their daily lives. "My grandmother would have loved to see this," Priya reflected one evening as they sat in the garden that had been transformed from a showcase of expensive landscaping into a working farm that supplied fresh produce to the community center. "She always said that wisdom reveals itself through action, not through thinking." Alexander nodded, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors above the vegetables and fruit trees that now filled what had once been ornamental space. The garden had become a perfect metaphor for the transformation of resources from beautiful but useless luxury into practical abundance that nourished others. The most unexpected development in Alexander's journey came when he decided to sell his yacht, the Crown Jewel, which had been sitting unused in Marina del Rey for years. The 150-foot vessel represented exactly the kind of wealth's display that the manuscript had taught him to question. Rather than simply selling it to another wealthy individual, Alexander decided to experiment with a different approach. He issued a public challenge through social media and local news outlets. Anyone who could provide the most compelling vision for using the yacht's sale proceeds to benefit their community would receive the full value of the vessel to fund their project. The challenge attracted hundreds of responses from nonprofit organizations, community groups, and social entrepreneurs with innovative ideas for creating positive change. The winning proposal came from a coalition of marine biology students and environmental activists who wanted to create a floating educational center that would travel to underserved coastal communities, providing hands-on science education and raising awareness about ocean conservation. The project would transform the luxury yacht into a platform for inspiring the next generation of environmental stewards. Alexander was deeply moved by the proposal's combination of practical education and environmental consciousness. As he signed over the yacht's title to the nonprofit organization, he felt the final lesson of the manuscript clicking into place. True wealth wasn't measured by what you owned, but by what you could transform into meaningful action for others. The yacht challenge attracted significant media attention, inspiring other wealthy individuals to consider creative ways of repurposing luxury assets for community benefit. Alexander found himself once again in the unexpected role of catalyst, encouraging others to see their possessions as potential instruments of positive change rather than simply symbols of success. Marcus, who had witnessed Alexander's entire transformation from the unique vantage point of the kitchen, offered perhaps the most insightful observation about the change he had witnessed. "You know what's remarkable?" Marcus said one morning as they watched Priya teaching a group of local children how to harvest vegetables from the garden. "You're the same person you always were, but now you're being yourself on purpose instead of by accident." The comment captured something essential about Alexander's journey. The manuscript hadn't changed his fundamental nature or given him new capabilities. It had simply helped him align his existing resources and abilities with his deepest values and most authentic desires for contribution. As Alexander approached his 65th birthday, he reflected on the strange gift his grandfather had given him 34 years earlier. The Sanskrit manuscript still sat in its place of honor in the library, but it no longer felt like an unsolved mystery. It felt like a compass that had guided him home to himself, to his family, and to his true purpose. The foundation had grown into a significant force for systemic change, with programs in dozens of communities and a model that was being replicated internationally. The Wisdom Circle had evolved into a movement of individuals committed to conscious wealth stewardship. Most importantly, Alexander's relationship with Sarah had become the source of joy and meaning he had been unconsciously seeking through decades of external achievement. Do you ever regret the years you spent obsessing over the manuscript instead of living your life? Sarah asked during one of their garden conversations, as they worked together to prepare seedlings for the community center's new location. Alexander considered the question carefully, thinking about the marriages that had failed, the relationships that had suffered, the isolation and frustration of his long search for understanding. "I used to think those years were wasted," he replied finally, "but now I realize they were necessary preparation. I needed to exhaust all the external seeking before I could be open to the internal transformation." The manuscript taught me patience, if nothing else, the willingness to stay with something important even when it doesn't make sense. As the sun set over the garden that evening, Alexander felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of achievement or acquisition, but the completion of understanding. His grandfather's gift had been perfect in its timing, its challenge, and its ultimate revelation. The manuscript remained on his desk, its Sanskrit characters still mysterious to his eyes but no longer to his heart. Occasionally, he would share passages with visitors or foundation partners, not as ancient wisdom to be decoded, but as poetry to be appreciated. The words had become less important than the transformation they had catalyzed, less significant than the love they had helped him discover and express. Priya continued to work with the foundation, her grandmother's wisdom proving endlessly valuable in building programs that honored both practical needs and spiritual dignity. Her presence in Alexander's life had been the key that unlocked not just the manuscript's meaning, but his own capacity for authentic generosity and meaningful connection. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.